The protagonist finds himself in a state of confusion, unsure of where he is, believing that everything is just a dream. Then, the famous system, which he hopes to only see after death, appears and presents two options. The first is a girl who loves him, takes care of him, and does everything for him. The second is an independent, powerful, sexy, glamorous girl. Rich, the whole package, but who has no time to devote to him. The protagonist chooses the second option. Upon seeing Angie, he wonders if she is truly his. He wakes up believing it was all a dream. But soon Jigs appears, ordering him to move to her village and marry her immediately. After the wedding, the protagonist is still in shock, thinking that his life isn't that bad. He chose this life, and doesn't understand what he could complain about. At that moment, Jigs's grandfather appears, observing that the protagonist looks a lot like his father. It is revealed that the grandfather was saved by the protagonist's father, and, although he searched for him for years, he never found him. However, upon seeing that the protagonist has married, he feels at peace. The protagonist asks if Jigs is happy with the marriage, and, of course, she is not, but he assures her that he will take care of her, leading the grandfather to think he made the right choice. After the grandfather's departure, making it clear that they have no family ties, the protagonist complains to the system about the treatment he has received and tries to make a new choice, but he can't. So that's that. This doesn't discourage him. With determination, he decides to win Jigs over for good. Inside the village, the protagonist is ironing Jigs's favorite dress, and she scolds him for not doing it right and for not contributing financially. He apologizes, explaining that he's still a second-year student and hasn't graduated yet. This irritates Jigs, who calls him incompetent. While she changes clothes, the protagonist becomes embarrassed and ends up being thrown out, with Jigs asking if he's just incompetent or also a pervert. Irritated, the protagonist runs into his mother-in-law and loose Oxwan, whom we'll call the Blonde. The Blonde, also a student, is rich, which bothers the protagonist even more. The mother-in-law criticizes the protagonist, claiming that in the university, some people are destined for success, while others are just a waste. The Blonde defends the protagonist, saying they have something in common: their love for Jigs. This infuriates the protagonist. Jigs comes down and asks what the commotion is about. Upon seeing her, the Blonde runs to her, complimenting her beauty and offering her a ride in her car, since the mother-in-law mentioned that their car broke down. Jigs declines the offer, and her mother questions if she thinks the protagonist can take care of her. The Blonde tries to humiliate him for not having a luxury car, but, at that moment, the system presents him with options: a brother who has billions but despises him, or a common and obedient brother. Obviously, he chooses the second option. As they leave, they meet the brother chosen by the protagonist, who we'll call Morado. He arrives in a rented limousine, which humiliates the Blonde, who promises to get revenge on the protagonist at any cost. At Jigs's grandfather's birthday party, the Blonde presents the protagonist with a 50-year-old ginseng, which he must offer to the grandfather. She asks him not to misinterpret her, as she doesn't want her reputation to be tarnished by revealing that her fiancé couldn't give a worthy gift. The protagonist seems not to hear her, as he ends up misinterpreting her intentions, believing that she has feelings for him. When he sees the grandfather surrounded by several women, he is surprised. This, folks, proves that we're not ugly, just poor. Anyone who says otherwise is mistaken. Just before the protagonist delivers his gift, the Blonde shows up with a present as well. She brought a 100-year-old ginseng, and with simple logic of compound interest raised to the square, we can conclude that her gift is 100 years old. Guys, I took a break from the manhwa to say that if you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, but 90% of those who watch the video don't subscribe, so I'm counting on your help. Now, let's go back to the manhwa. The blonde taunts the protagonist, urging him to present his gift, and everyone belittles him, saying that a country boy can't give something of value, including one of the grandfather's women, who questions if they are really going to marry the granddaughter to someone so poor. The protagonist hesitates to open the gift out of shame, but the system gives him two options: an oil from an Indian god that he doesn't know what it's for, but it seems interesting, or an 800-year-old ginseng, which he ends up choosing. Personally, I think it would have been intriguing if he had chosen the first option. Now confident, the protagonist challenges the blonde to a bet. Whoever presents the worst gift must leave. He hands over the 800-year-old ginseng, saying that his father found it in the mountains and wishes the grandfather to live another 800 years. Everyone is shocked, and he sarcastically bids farewell to the blonde, telling her to be careful on the way out, which makes her even angrier. The grandfather congratulates him and asks him to accompany him. Along the way, the protagonist drops a pocket watch. Upon opening it, he sees a picture of a woman and is surprised to notice the resemblance to Jig's. He learns that the woman was one of the grandfather's wives, who died young. Jig's approaches, asking where he got such a valuable gift, as she doesn't believe that his father found it. She warns him not to use dishonest methods to make money, as it won't hide his scams. The protagonist questions Jigs's impression of him, but she shows little interest and mentions something called poverty. I know that hurt more than one of us here, but don't worry, because the protagonist replies that the rich only classify people based on money and asks how much it takes not to be considered poor anymore, and more importantly, how much he needs to win her over. This irritates her so much that she slaps him, making it clear that her man doesn't need to be rich, but also shouldn't pretend to be someone he's not. The protagonist begins to wonder if he did something wrong, especially because Jitsu seems upset, maybe thinking he stole the ginseng. During a table meeting, the grandfather starts a conversation about the inheritance of shares and reveals that he owns 56% of the ANSI group, announcing his intention to give 20% to someone, which surprises everyone. As expected, this person is the protagonist. The atmosphere changes, and everyone becomes furious, accusing him of always being after the old man's fortune. The grandfather slams the table, demanding silence and stating that the real greedy ones are them, warning that if the protagonist isn't the heir, no one will get anything. The angry expressions of the others turn towards the protagonist, who feels the pressure of silent threats not to accept the offer, fearing the consequences. He wants to ask Jitsu for help, but she is also upset, thinking that if he signs the papers, he'll become rich and no longer have to fear being despised. The protagonist hesitates. However, remembering what Jitsu told him, he decides to tear up the inheritance documents, surprising the grandfather. He declares that he will earn his money on his own so that Jitsu won't suffer and will stay by his side of her own free will. This act embarrasses Jitsu, changing the impression she had of him. The grandfather regrets not getting to know him better, and the protagonist expresses the same sentiment. The grandfather asks him to call him brother, but Jitsu tries to change the subject. The protagonist teases her, suggesting that she call him grandfather, which irritates her. And, well, what happened next? You can already imagine. Jackson tries to help the protagonist, who is already drunk, but they end up stumbling, and as is typical in manhwa stories, some coincidences happen. The protagonist, happy, thanks Jitsu for her irritation, as she has always been cold to him. Even irritated, he considers her beautiful, but embarrassed, she leaves him alone. Suddenly, a girl appears, pretending to be his wife, and asks how much he drank since he doesn't even recognize her. The protagonist, still dizzy, believes her and follows her. The next day, upon waking up, he receives a call from Jitsu, who asks where he is. He thinks he's home, but she, furious, demands a divorce, accusing him of lying, as he is being searched on the internet. The girl wakes up and asks who he was talking to. Desperate, the protagonist realizes that he's with Yuli, an influencer with 10 million followers. While he was sleeping, Leolito took a picture with him, posted it, and announced they were a couple. Yuli enters the room because Liu Li called her to talk. Jitsu, disappointed with the protagonist, demands that he prepare to explain the situation to the grandfather and that they will get a divorce. The protagonist realizes that this all seems like a conspiracy and wonders who could have orchestrated it. He locks himself in the bathroom, claiming he's going to take a shower to buy time, while Jitsu, even though she knew they were getting divorced, didn't imagine it would be because of another woman. She wonders if she's not good or attractive enough. Meanwhile, the protagonist, worried and unsure of what to do, notices that the value of the Ansi family shares is plummeting. He concludes that the person responsible to set up this conspiracy, it can't be someone from the Ansi family, and he suspects it was the blonde. Everyone reaches their own conclusions, don't they? The system asks the protagonist if he wants help, but he chooses to solve everything on his own. In response, the system informs him that since he is independent, he now has two options to improve his situation. The first is Onsetian, a carefree man who does everything with ease. The second is Sangun Warner, a strategic advisor and right-hand man to the former emperor. Confused by the situation, the protagonist questions what is happening, and the system explains that a hidden setting appears when the user doesn't make smart decisions, resulting in random options. Now that he has become independent, the system state can be reset with new options. If you didn't understand, don't worry, I'm confused too. To sum up, the system sees the protagonist as someone not very bright. He chooses the second option, hoping to avoid further complications with women. Upon arrival, his grandfather becomes irritated when he sees that the protagonist has brought another woman in front of his granddaughter, calling him a scoundrel. An irony, since the grandfather has 4 girlfriends at the same time. The grandfather asks if it is true that the protagonist used the family's money to be with Yuli. At that moment, the system makes the protagonist recall the photo of his grandmother on the pocket watch, making him realize that, despite having lost his wife, his grandfather still loves her. He admits that he sought out Yuli, but denies using the family's money. The mother-in-law complains about the infidelity, and the protagonist, in response, vents that he could no longer bear being with Jitsu for months without being able to do anything, so he sought pleasure elsewhere. But his heart belongs only to her. This statement makes Jitsu blush, something that probably wouldn't happen in real life. The grandfather laughs and tells Jitsu that a man with 3 wives and 4 concubines is within his rights, as long as his heart is with them. This relieves the protagonist, but makes Yuli think he is despicable. They argue about the value of the shares, and the protagonist promises that, within a month, he will make up for the family's losses. Otherwise, he will no longer be their son-in-law. It is revealed that he created his own milk coffee shop, and upon seeing Yuli in her live streams, he takes the opportunity to advertise, which makes her furious. Still, he kisses her, making her blush, and says that if he continues to profit, he won't get divorced, and she will remain by his side. This declaration makes her cry because she dreamed of becoming the daughter-in-law of the blonde's family. During the night, Murado comments on the fame of the milk coffee shop, thanks to the system. However, the protagonist is still worried because he doesn't have enough money to cover the family's losses. At that moment, the system alerts him to problems, and the protagonist immediately asks about Yuli. Murado informs him that she left after receiving a call. The scene cuts to Yuli, who is with the blonde, and the latter says that to destroy the protagonist, Yuli will have to do some unpleasant things. Yuli is confused and tries to walk away, but the blonde grabs her, asking her to sacrifice herself for him. The blonde calls some men, who start recording her. Yuli begs for help, but the blonde just laughs, instructing her to do well in the video. The men accuse Yuli of lending 500,000 yuan to the protagonist's shop, showing a receipt signed by her as proof. Obviously, everything was forged by the blonde. They claim they went to the protagonist so he could pay up, but instead, he handed Yuli over to record a film. The protagonist arrives to save her and hands over a card, suggesting they use it to cover the supposed debt. In flashbacks, it is revealed that the system had issued an emergency warning asking him to go to Lily immediately, but the protagonist ignored it, claiming he was busy. The system warned him about the dangers of ignoring emergency alerts, and he had no choice. With only 10 minutes left to find Lily, the protagonist, anticipating this kind of situation, had installed GPS on her phone. He finds the blonde and asks where Lily is, but she laughs and warns him that he'll have to pay to rescue her. And, well, we know what happens next. At the office, the grandfather was very worried about the news circulating about the protagonist, who was being called the biggest bastard in history by journalists. The protagonist, in turn, complained, suggesting they should refer to him as the most attractive man in history. He questioned why Jitsu married him, and mentioned that Lily was always by his side, making people believe the bad reputation. Determined to clear his name, he announced that he would do an interview to tell his whole story. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law expressed her dissatisfaction with the protagonist's arrogance, but the grandfather remained confident in him. Days later, the Han family stocks began to rise again. The blonde was informed that Luan Fang, an internet celebrity, had interviewed the protagonist, garnering over 500 million views and crashing the blonde's live streaming platform, causing her stock value to plummet. In the interview, the protagonist claimed to be so attractive that he couldn't avoid women approaching him, including those from the Luo family, since the blonde couldn't satisfy them, calling her trash. With a plan in mind, the blonde considered stealing the milk coffee formula, but soon realized the cost was high. Determined, she called Mr. Chen to help her get revenge on the grandfather for something that had happened years ago. Meanwhile, Luan Fang offered the protagonist a 50 million won commission for the live stream and asked him to contact her if he had any more news. She pondered whether the protagonist was trustworthy, as he never tried to take advantage of her. When he got home, the protagonist found Jitsu waiting for him. When she asked where he had been, he replied that he was trying to make up for the family's stock losses, so they wouldn't need to get divorced. Jackson watched the scene, making the protagonist a bit uncomfortable. The grandfather had asked Jitsu to get to know the protagonist better because it was rare for someone to revalue stock so quickly, and they needed a strong leader for the family, a king capable of facing any situation. And who better than the protagonist for that role? He confessed to Jitsui that he wouldn't be able to fulfill everything the grandfather wanted, but he assured her she could always count on him, and that he would stand by her side, even if everyone thought he had no money, fame, or power. What he truly valued was having a beautiful wife whom he loved, making Jitsui blush. In private, the grandfather confided to the protagonist that he planned to buy a property from the Luo family and would meet with the blonde at a villa to discuss the matter. At that moment, a notification appeared above the grandfather's head, asking if he wanted to make an update. The protagonist accidentally triggered the update. The system transformed into a girl, according to the protagonist's preferences, and he named her Shen Long.